Hi, welcome back to Josie Two Shoes, a channel where we talk about language learning and diving into East Asian culture. If you haven't seen the first part of the series, please click here. By the way, I've planted 2 Easter eggs in this video, so if you watch until the very end, you'll get some additional nuggets of information that you weren't expecting. So when I first made this video, I had a lot of ideas and thoughts, but I didn't want to make the video too complicated or too long, so I just kind of stuck with basic things without doing a lot of literature review. But because a lot of you guys had questions and thoughts relating to the things I said, I decided, you know what, I should answer those questions, expand upon some of the things I was talking about, and clarify some of them in a part 2. So that's why we're here. So you may not be interested in every topic I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to list them out and then you can click on the chapter that's relevant for you. Number 1, situations with many tone 3s in a row. Number 2, full E tone sandhi. 3, full bu tone sandhi. 4, neutral tone. What is it and what does it sound like? 5, assimilatory tone effects. And 6, tone's phonological properties. I've included a references section in the description bar, so if you're interested in learning more, please go there. Before I start, I want to clarify that language learning isn't about rigorous memorization of grammar and pronunciation rules. Even me, I haven't learned every grammar or pronunciation rule out there, and if you ask any Chinese speaker, they probably can't tell you all of them either. Language is fluid, and depending on the context, it may change, especially in tones. So there may be times when I say something or your Chinese teacher says something that is not necessarily what you hear in real life, and that is okay. Additionally, Standard Mandarin is based officially off the Beijing dialect, but it also borrows from other Mandarin dialects. Even the rules of Standard Mandarin differ quite a lot from what actual local Beijing people say. Not to mention that other places in northern China speak Mandarin as their mother language. They may have some rules that are different than Standard Mandarin. If you add in the other places in China that don't speak a variation of Mandarin as their mother tone, their tones may be slightly or significantly different than what you're used to hearing when you actually talk to them. So most people in China who've had at least a high school education, they try to speak Standard Mandarin, but their accuracy may vary based on their background. So I hope you keep an open mind when you speak to native speakers and let what you hear guide you. So-called experts are only experts because they really care about a topic and want to spend a lot of time learning about it. Not everything that I or an expert says will be 100% accurate, so please keep an open mind. And without further ado, so I mentioned last time that if you have 2 tone 3s in a row, the first tone 3 turns into tone 2. That's all great and good, but what if you have more than 2 tone 3s in a row? Does every tone 3 turn into tone 2 other than the last tone 3? So I'm just gonna call this kind of phenomenon a tone sandhi train. I coined this term. Maybe I'll write a paper about it. So depending on the context, the answer may vary. The official rules, like that the official standard language website gives, is that if you're speaking it fast, yes, there should be a tone sandhi train, as in everyone but the last tone 3 should be a tone 2. So for example, the examples they gave were 3-syllabic words. For example, this word you see right here on your screen. So if you read these words separately, you have guan, li, zhe. So if you know a basic Chinese, you should know the first 2 characters form one word, which means guanli, or manage. So guanli is always read guanli. So there should be no worries there. I think the concern is whether li turns into tone 2 in front of zhe. In this circumstance, it does. It's read as guanli zhe, fast. Here's another example. Read separately, the 3 characters are Chen, Lan, Guan. But everyone knows that the first 2 characters form one word, which means Zhanlan. It means exhibition or exhibit, and Guan means hall. And if we put it together, do we get a tone sandhi train? Yes, we do. We have Zhanlan Guan, Zhanlan Guan. If you say it fast, native speakers will say Zhanlan Guan. So there are instances where you have 3 characters that are tone 3 in a row, but you don't have a tone sandhi train. What are those circumstances? So this is not going to be exhaustive. I'm going to give you 2 examples of this. First example would be this phrase. 指老虎. So you may have heard 老虎, which means tiger in Chinese, and 指 in front of tiger is some phrase that you might have heard, paper tiger, which means someone who acts really fierce, but on the inside, they're very weak. So the way that this word is pronounced in Chinese is 指老虎. Yes, so it's not forming a tone sandhi train, and it's a bit hard for me to tell you exactly why, but I think it has to do with the fact that 指 is a separate morpheme from 老虎, and so I think what happens is that if the first sound cuts off the kind of disyllabic chain, as in like with 管理者, that one is not cut off because the first like strong morpheme is disyllabic. With 指, since it's this one monosyllabic morpheme, it kind of breaks off the kind of flow. So there's not going to be any native speakers who say 指老虎. It's just very strange. Native speakers will say 指老虎. Another circumstance of tone sandhi train not happening is in this circumstance. Read separately, you have 买, 雨, 伞. But everyone knows that these are two separate words. We have 买, which means buy, and 雨伞, which means umbrella. Nobody will say 雨伞. Everyone will say 雨伞. So now we're worried about whether 买 will turn into tone 2 in this tone sandhi situation. And it doesn't. Because there's word boundaries, and 买 is not going to combine with a object that is serving as the object of its verb. So we're not going to have 买雨伞, we're going to have 买雨伞. Okay, Julie, that's all great and good, but what if we have a longer example? So someone in the comments gave me this sentence right here. And this is a 5-character chain that is all tone 3. So what happens here? Like I mentioned earlier, even with tone sandhi, you have to look at the context and the word boundaries that happen. So you have 我, I would say is on its own. 5点 is on its own, and within 5点 we know there is tone sandhi there. And then 给你. And so that's how I would break it down. 我5点给你. I think there are some people who would not do 给你. They might say 给你. They might actually just do like a low 3, 给你. But I think it's quite unnatural. So I think in normal speech we would say 我5点给你. If you have some disagreements about this, please give them to me in the comments below. So after I made the video last week about E tone changes, I actually started to have some difficulty sleeping. It's because I said that E is tone 1 unless it's in front of tone 4, in which it turns into tone 2, but there are actually instances where E changes into tone 4 in front of tones 1, 2, and 3. So I kind of forgot about this because E is just one of those things that you don't really think about. It just kind of turns into whatever the tone is depending on the context. I realized that people may have been taught about E wrong. So I just did a deep dive, and I'm gonna have basically a list of all the instances where you're gonna actually pronounce E in a certain way. Like I mentioned earlier, I would not try to memorize these. In fact, I would recommend you not memorize them unless they all make sense to you. My pro tip is that even if you say E with a tone 1 in the wrong circumstance, I would say that depending on the context, the speakers will definitely understand what you're saying because the base tone for E is 1. So just keep that in mind. So when is E tone 1? It's base tone. Obviously, when it's by itself, when it's at the end of a phrase or sentence, or when it's used as a number, or in specific fixed phrases. As you know, E is a number, and so in no circumstance, when you use E as a number, like as a sequential number, a numerical number, it does not change into any other tone. So you can have 21, 11, 第一, even if you have 一号. So there may be some kind of changes to E in the future, but 一号, as in number 1 or the first day of a month, you will say 一号. Yeah, as a number, it is going to be tone 1. And there is a phrase, 一一, it actually means 1 by 1. And it doesn't matter what the circumstance of 一一 is, it may have other tones after it. Both of the E's in 一一 are going to be tone 1. It sounds kind of like a tongue twister, right? I'll give you some examples of 一. So 一 means one by one. It's an adverbial phrase. Usually you would add it to a verb. So some examples of 一 in context are 一对应. 一对应 is actually a mathematical term you will learn maybe in like elementary school math. It means one-to-one correspondence, kind of like two-dimensional things. Different like x, y will be matching in two different dimensions, kind of like that. And then you would have 一检查, which means check one by one. So this is a specific unique situation where 一 does not change within itself, and even if there's a context after it. So like I mentioned in the other video, that tone 1 turns into tone 2 in front of tone 4. It's very simple. I'll give you some examples. 一样, 一下子, 一会儿, 一块儿, 一次. And the thing I wanted to correct is E is going to be tone 4 in front of tones 1, 2, or 3, not including the exceptions I mentioned earlier. So some examples of this would be 一般, 一年, 一口, 一起, 一种. And then tone 1 is actually a neutral tone, 轻声, in the two following circumstances. The first circumstance is when it is in between duplicate verbs. So for example, 试一试, 想一想, 看一看. And it is a 轻声 or neutral tone when it is used in between a verb or adjective and a measure word. So for example, 去一趟, 认识一下, 好一点, 贵一些. Since we're on the topic of E tone sandhi, I wanted to bring 不 back because 不 also has changes that make it a 轻声in circumstances. Just a quick reminder, 不 is tone 4 by itself or at the end of a phrase or sentence, and it's tone 2 in front of a tone 4, such as 不要, 不错, 不是, 不在, 不认识. And 不 is a 轻声 or neutral tone when it is in the similar circumstances as in 一, when it's in a verb complement phrase or when it's in a reduplicated verb phrase, such as 说不定, 用不着, 差不多, 等不及, 能不能, 会不会, 贵不贵, 认识不认识. So it's the first Easter egg. Some people in the previous video commented about my master's and PhD theses and whether they could read it online. And unfortunately, my master's thesis is not online, but my PhD thesis is, although it is 150 pages and it's on my university library. So if you're interested in reading that, only if you're interested, leave me a comment and I'll link you. I will do a quick summary of my master's thesis though, because it is more relevant to language learning. So when I was studying my master's, I was quite interested in the concept of the critical period hypothesis. This is a theory that believes there is a specific period of life, usually when you're a child or an adolescent, that is the golden period of language learning. And if you start learning a language after this time frame, then you will not become native-like in your acquisition. My master's thesis was trying to figure out if this critical period really exists, specifically for pronunciation. And spoiler alert, it does. So if you're interested in learning more about this, I can make a future video about it. Now, back to the main content. So neutral tone. You may have noticed that I did not talk about neutral tone or 轻声 in my previous video. And the reason I didn't is because there's a lot of controversy over this neutral tone. So I wanted to stay out of it. But because there were questions about it, I decided, you know what? Let's just talk about it. So some people believe that 轻声 is a tone 5. Some people believe that it is toneless. Some people believe that it is highly dependent on the previous syllable. Some people believe that it actually has its own tone targets. And then other people believe that it is basically a stressless tone. I don't really have a strong belief on the categorization of 轻声, but I will tell you about the phonological properties of 轻声so you can make a decision for yourself. What 轻声is phonologically is a shorter and weaker sound compared to the standard 4 tones, and it doesn't have a specific pitch height or contour. It is just shorter and weaker compared to the previous syllable, and it doesn't exist on its own, which means that there is a lot of tonal assimilation when 轻声 is involved, which means that 轻声and the previous tone will give mutual tone changes to each other. Before I get into the behavior of 轻声, I need to give you some linguistics terminology. In linguistics terms, the pitch height of a sound is called F0 or fundamental frequency. The starting height of a syllable's pitch is called onset, and the ending height is called offset. The following are patterns that I've noticed when just hearing qingsheng and how it relates to the previous sounds, but there's not necessarily like a handbook that says like this exactly is what qingsheng is, so just keep that in mind. When qingsheng appears after a tone 1, qingsheng tends to be lower in height. So I'll give you an example, 哥哥, 爸爸, 桌子, 说. You can hear that the second syllable, which is the qingsheng, is slightly lower in height. When qingsheng is after a tone 2, the tone 2 actually doesn't reach its max height like it normally does, and it actually stops short of it, followed by a slightly lower qingsheng. I'll give you an example. 同学们, 同学们. Normally 同学 goes all the way up, but when it's followed by men, which is the neutral, it actually kind of stops in the middle way. 同学们, 同学们. When a qingsheng appears after a tone 3, this tone 3 turns into a half tone 3, so it is very low. Because of that, the qingsheng after it is a lot higher. So for example, 你呢? 走吧. When a qingsheng appears after a tone 4, it is slightly higher than the ending, the offset of the tone 4, but only slightly. It's not as high as after tone 3. Example, 是吗? 是吗? In my personal opinion, and the opinion of other linguists, if there is a disyllabic word and the second syllable is a qingsheng, the first syllable tends to have stress. Or what I mean by stress is that it's longer and louder. You can hear it when people say, words like 是吗? 好啊? Things like that. The first syllable tends to be stressed. So qingsheng appears in a lot of places, not just in like yuqi, like what I mentioned earlier, like what they call modal words. It appears in a lot of phrases, like even if you don't really realize it. So for example, I just realized like 认识, the 识 in 认识 is a qingsheng, and like I never thought about it, but I would never say 认识, which is very strange. The reason I'm saying this is because qingsheng is not really like formally emphasized in schools. Even native speakers like don't really recognize when they're saying qingsheng. It just comes out because that's the way they learned it growing up. And so even for you, I would say you should not stress about using qingsheng, like where should I use qingsheng? If I don't use qingsheng, I'm not speaking it correctly. I would say that's not necessary. So something that you should know is that local Beijing people will use qingsheng quite a lot more than people who are speaking standard Mandarin. And actually, a lot of Beijing people, local Beijing people, they will kind of try to figure out your background based on how much you use qingsheng. So just the FYI, like Beijing people use a lot of qingsheng a lot of times, and they use a lot of erhua. But I would say you should not worry about where they think you're from based on your qingsheng usage. Just do whatever feels comfortable and what you've kind of heard in your exposure to Chinese. So because the previous section on qingsheng was way too long, I'm going to keep this topic short and sweet. And to be honest with you, once I say it, it's going to be quite intuitive or even obvious to you. The onset of a tone will be assimilated to the offset of the previous tone. So what this means is if one tone ends high on a high pitch, then the next syllable starting pitch will be higher as well. If the tone of the first word ends lower, then the starting pitch of the next word is also going to start lower. So I'm going to give you an example that's going to make this very clear. So I'm going to say the word 燃烧. 燃 is a tone 2 and it ends very high. And then 烧 is a tone 1, but usually medium to medium high. But after 燃, 烧 becomes very high. So you can hear me when I say 燃烧, 燃烧. Basically, the height of 烧 is kind of like assimilated to the end of 燃, which ends very high. So you have 燃烧, 燃烧. But when I put 烧after a low tone, for example, 火, if I say 火烧, 火烧, so 火 is a half tone 3 and it ends very low. So 烧 is going to be assimilated to the end of that. So we have 火烧. 火烧 is very different than 燃烧. So phonologically, 烧 is the same word in both these circumstances, but acoustically, when pronounced in different contexts, it's gonna have a different tonal outcome. So far in this section, I've mentioned carryover tone effects, which means that the first tone will affect the second tone. But to be honest, there are also anticipatory tone effects, which means the tone of a upcoming word is going to affect the tone of the current word. And I mentioned that to you in the neutral tone section, but this is not something that's common, so you don't need to think about it anymore. So I mentioned this in my previous video. The last part of my video, I mentioned that Mandarin speakers do not only use the pitch height and contour of a tone to recognize it, they also use the duration and the intensity. Some people in the comments say, okay, do you have any research backing this up? It's funny because I didn't think of this concept on my own, obviously. I came up with it after years of research. I had seen a lot of academic papers that had made these statements, and because there are people who asked about it, I did some more digging, and it turns out that even now there are people doing research on this very same topic. There was someone who mentioned in the comments of the previous video that of course Mandarin has phonological properties outside of pitch, contour, and height, because otherwise how would speakers be able to whisper to each other? And this person is absolutely correct, a very wise person. In linguistics terms, the pitch, height, and contour are considered the primary cues of tonal recognition, and the duration and intensity are considered secondary cues. There have been a lot of studies in which the researchers wiped out the tones of someone's recording, or they asked them to whisper, or actually asked them to sing, and then asked another group of participants to try to recognize which each syllable's tone is. The results vary from study to study, but the overwhelming consensus is that native speakers use both primary and secondary cues to try to figure out what a tone is. Easter egg number 2. This is the long-awaited real tone chart that I've been hinting at since the beginning of the video from the thumbnail. And to be honest, there's not just one, I have several of these. So I have to start off by saying that each recording will be different, depending on the experiment, depending on the participants involved, depending on their background, depending on whether they were told to say things very strictly, like long, or they can say it very casually. It's gonna affect the specific tone contour results. But here I just wanted to give you a study that was done in which they collected the average of the tone contours of the F0 of the 4 tones from, I think, 48 different participants. And you can see in this chart that it's not quite the same as the official chart. So tone 4 is the shortest, but if you just look at half tone 3, it is about the same duration. And depending on the experiment, we've had like tone 3 be even shorter than the full tone 4. So it depends on the experiment, like I mentioned, but generally tone 3 cutoff is the shortest, or tied with 4 as the shortest. Tone 1 is longer than both of these, and then tone 2 is even longer. Tone 3 said in full tends to be the longest. You can also see that the tones are not perfect. So when I first started doing recordings of myself speaking, and then putting it on Pratt and then doing the analysis, I was shocked that, tone 2 actually dips before it goes up, and that tone 4 tends to go up before it comes down. And I think that this just happens just due to some kind of vocal cord thing, is in that, our vocal cords are not perfect, and that they have to have some kind of like rounding before they can actually go on a steep decline that way, or up. So I would not pay attention to this. This is just kind of like a vocal cord thing. And so I have an example of another experiment where you can actually see the males and the females separated. Females are on top, males on the bottom, and it actually shows you the different curves of each individual participant. And you can see that there is a lot of individual variation. And like I mentioned earlier, like tones are not absolute, depending on a speaker's voice, depending on whether they're trying to say it quickly or trying to say it very formally. You're gonna have different kind of contours and even pitches for them. And so yeah, I wanna emphasize there is no fixed F0 for any tone. So for me, I personally have a bit of a lower voice. So my F0 for my tone 1 is more like on the lower side, like maybe 3 and 3.5. But for some people, their F1 for tone 1 may be 4, like 4.5. So you can see that males tend to have a comparatively lower tone 1 F0. I've been told that I have a lower vocal range for a female. So it's possible that my tone 1 is kind of more assimilated to the how males will pronounce it. But yeah, so it's just something to take note, because it really is up to the individual. And none of these people have any problems with communication in real life, because, you know, they've lived speaking Chinese their whole life. And even if their pronunciation is, you know, not the norm, people understand, and that's still a native level pronunciation. Okay, so that concludes my second part of this two-parter tone series, which I did not expect I would have to make, but I'm really glad I did, because you guys raised some really great questions that made me like dig deeper into my notes and do some more reading on the literature that's been out there. I hope it's been helpful. I admit that it's probably quite overwhelming for some of you. And like, I just wanted to end by saying that you don't have to take this as like the Bible. This is not the end all be all of all tones. There are more things that are being learned about tones, you know, every day as there's more research done. But I would say as like a language learner, you don't have to worry too much about like what the specifics are. This is just to show you that if you're hearing certain tones in a certain way that is not taught in the textbook, you're not crazy, you're not having some hearing problems. But I do want to say that depending on the speaker's background that you're talking to, even if they're a native speaker, they may have certain regional differences, and that there is no such thing as like 100% perfect tone pronunciation. Even though I may have stated earlier that this is the secret to perfect tone pronunciation, and my answer to that is that there is no perfect tone pronunciation. Just, you know, what is natural. So with that in mind, I hope you guys enjoy this video, and please watch this video to learn more about how to get more fluent in any language that you're learning. Bye.